Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of Front and Off Center, Fashion in Southeast Asia. We had a wonderful first day of the conference, and I am very glad to be continuing the conversations we began yesterday. Today, we will have sessions on sustainability in fashion, fashion spreads, the PHX Fashion Group to represent collectives in fashion, artists and fashion photography and film. If you have a question for any of the speakers, please type them into the chat box anytime, and we will get to them at the end of each session. Thank you for spending time with us today. I would now like to pass the mic over to Akila Zailan, the chairperson of the 5th session of the conference. Akila, over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Akila Zailan. Excuse me. Hi, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on day 2 of Front and Off Center, Fashion and Southeast Asia at the Kotal Research Forum. My name is Akila Zailan, and I am the founder of Studio Gypsy, a slow fashion label from Singapore that uncovers the stories of batik and the people who make them. I will be the chairperson for this session on sustainability in fashion. The presenters will each give a 15 to 20-minute presentation. We will then have a joint Q&A segment where you can type in your questions for the speakers in the chat box. I would now like to introduce you to Dr. Harriet Richards, who is a lecturer in fashion enterprise at RMIT University, Melbourne. She is co-founder of the Critical Fashion Studies Research Group and co-host of the Critical Fashion Studies podcast. Her work has been published in academic journals, including Cultural Studies, Australian Family Studies and Gender, Work and Organization, and in the edited collection, Rethinking Fashion Globalization, published by Bloomsbury in 2021. In the same year, she co-edited with Natalia Lusty and Rimi Han a special issue on fashion futures for Continuum, Journal of Media and Cultural Studies. Dr. Richards, over to you.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. That was really lovely. Let me just share my screen. Wonderful. Kia ora koutou. Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all. It's so wonderful to be able to connect online through events such as this. And I'd really like to thank Nadia and the whole team for the wonderful work they've done to bring this conference together. It's been incredibly well organized. So it's been a real pleasure to be part of the panelist team. So before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm currently here in Melbourne on the lands of the Woiwurrung and Boomerang language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation. And I'd like to extend my respects to Wurundjeri elders past and present, and to any First Nations people we have with us here in the room today. As a Pākehā New Zealander, I feel incredibly grateful to be able to call the lands of the Wurundjeri people my home. And I'm honoured to be able to participate in events such as these, which extend long-standing traditions of gathering, knowledge sharing and celebration on country here in Naarm, Melbourne. So just clicking onto the right thing. There we go. With the rise in demand for ethical and sustainable fashion has also come the simultaneous increase in accreditation, certification and verification systems to classify fashion items that meet particular ethical or sustainable criteria. So this paper is part of a larger ongoing research interest in these sort of forms of accreditation and certification. I'm curious not only about how these systems of accreditation are implemented, but also how brands perceive their value as a reputation building tool, and also how they impact consumer decision making. So this paper really just constitutes one very small aspect of my larger thinking around these questions, and looks at just one case study, the Indonesian social enterprise Sukacita and the accreditation system B Corp. So I was inspired to investigate Sukacita's approach to ethical accreditation after being gifted one of their very beautiful, I have it here, natural indigo dyed scarves by a friend last year, and becoming interested in their approach to design and business. Then earlier this year, I had the opportunity to travel to Indonesia as part of an undergraduate study tour with a group of my students. And this visit gave me the chance to visit the Sukacita concept store in Jakarta's Ashtar District 8 Mall, and to talk to members of the fashion industry about the role of B Corp certifications in Indonesia. So what interests me about ethical and sustainable certification and accreditation systems is the assumption that the standards of assessment required for certification marks guarantees ethical and sustainable production. So there's widespread perception that third-party forms of certification and accreditation, such as Fair Trade, the Global Organic Textile Standard, or B Corp, and there's many more, as you can see on the screen, can provide global standards to which brands are held and upon which consumers can rely. And that's certainly true to an extent. However, far from being a straightforward marker of ethical and sustainable standards, these certifications and their multitudinous logos also have the potential to contribute to increased consumer confusion, to muddy the waters of ethical production, or simply to prove inconsequential, especially with a consumer unfamiliar with the tag. So of the many global accreditation systems claiming to certify elements of sustainable or ethical production, I'm interested in B Corp because of its reputation for rigor and reliability. To just briefly explain, B Corporation, the B here stands for benefit, formed out of B Lab, a global not-for-profit organization which was founded in the US in 2006 by a group of 3 friends at Stanford University who wanted to make business a force for good. Today, B Corp functions as a private, i.e. non-governmental. There's plenty of governmental certification systems too, which I'm also interested in, for for-profit companies to verify their social and environmental performance. As of the end of 2022, last year, there were over 5,500 certified B Corps globally. One of the key benefits of B Corp is that it's holistic. So it's focused not on a single social or environmental issue, but on the practices of the company as a whole. So companies must reapply for certification every 3 years and must ensure that they meet a baseline grade in a B impact score indicator of 80 out of a possible 200 points. So to begin with, the certification targeted small and medium-sized enterprises looking for a recognizable certification that would accredit the work they were already committed to. More recently, however, the certification has been granted to a number of large and multinational corporations, such as Nespresso, which has drawn the system of accreditation into question and led to claims of greenwashing. So there's already a bit of dissatisfaction with it. In Indonesia, as in many other Southeast Asian countries, and there is a little bit of research on B Corp in Vietnam, for instance, B Corp has experienced very slow uptake. Of the over 5,500 B Corps globally, only 11 are in Indonesia. Of these 11 brands, 4, including Sukacita, are fashion brands. As part of my research into the subject, I interviewed the founder and CEO of Ganashtim, Thomas Ng, who is driving the B Market Builder in Southeast Asia, which is a strategic partnership established in 2022 with the aim of increasing B Corp certification in the region. For him, the key hurdle preventing the acceleration of certification is the wait times for verification. Without a strong team to complete the work of verification, companies simply can't get verified. And this is certainly a major logistical challenge and one that he's working diligently to combat. And yet my question was a bit larger. I was curious as to whether there's enough knowledge of this certification in Indonesia and in Southeast Asia more broadly to make it valuable for brands and indeed for consumers. And then also a larger question, which perhaps is too large to tackle in this brief presentation, but I'm also curious to know if there is knowledge about it from brands and consumers, whether it's still actually a system of value in terms of accreditation, especially given the controversy surrounding its verification of brands such as Nespresso. So whether it's really become quite watered down from where it started. But I really wanted to look, and this is what this presentation is really all about, at how Sukacita as a social enterprise uses the B Corp branding in their own marketing and what this means both for the image of the business and perhaps more broadly for the promotion of ethical fashion in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. So Sukacita is not the only social enterprise to have B Corp certification. This is sort of a familiar and popular form of certification for social enterprises. However, Sukacita is the only fashion social enterprise in Indonesia with this B Corp certification. As a brand founded on supporting local makers rather than large-scale manufacturers, so villages, not factories, as their logo declares, the B Corp certification aims to solidify the brand's reputation for driving positive change in the fashion industry. For many B Corp certified fashion brands, the logo of certification can be found in an about page on the company website or nestled at the bottom of the page and some information about values. In comparison, for Sukacita, the B Corp certification seems to be an integral part of their brand identity. The brand website outlines the impact initiatives of the company, including their approach to working with women, supporting traditional craft techniques, growing their own cotton and dye plants, sourcing from sustainable suppliers, and offering free repairs and a garment take-back scheme. It also links to information about their certification, both B Corp and the ethically handcrafted accreditation, which they also have. The company is particularly proud of the fact that their first assessment yielded a score of 95.3 out of that possible 200, which is actually a really high grade for a fashion business, especially when you consider that Allbirds, the footwear company, has a score of 89.4. And the well-known American sustainable fashion brand Eileen Fisher has a score of 89.1. They're also vociferous about their achievement of the Best for the World award, which is a B Corp award, which acknowledges that they're among the top 5% of B Corps in the community category. So of the many categories that they're assessed on, that community category. So the brand's only bricks and mortar premises is their concept store in Jakarta's high-end Ashta District 8 mall. As you can see in this photograph, when I visited the store early in the year, a loom stands pride of place in the entrance to the store, alongside a mannequin wearing one of their exquisitely printed garments. The store is really not just a retail space, it's an opportunity for the brand to share their story, their values, and ethos with their customer. So printed calico, as you can see, hangs above the racks of curated garments, sharing the meaning behind the name Sukacita, which is all about well-being and connection. A video also plays on the screen between the racks, sharing footage of women working in the villages, dyeing fabrics and producing delicate embroidery or hand stitching smocked details. Alongside a display of bracelets and below a striking image of hands dyed blue with indigo, which was on the cover slide of this presentation, proudly sits the B Corp certification certificate. And on a large table arranged with scarves in the center of the store, there's a letter, which is the center image here, printed on rough handmade paper, printed in gold lettering and displayed under glass. And it welcomes the customer into the store, it reads, a space to reconnect with the journey and the impacts behind our clothes. The letter is signed by Sukacita founder, to quote, "Your nerd who cares, Danica Radini Fleisch," and is stamped with both the B Corp and ethically handmade logos. So this vocal promotion of the certification is also evident on the Sukacita Instagram account, where they promote their ethical status to their close to 50,000 followers through regular posts, reels, and stories. Currently pinned at the top of their profile is a reel posted in July 2022 that celebrates their Best for the World award. More recently, in March this year, a post links to story highlights where founder Danica and her husband and co-founder Bertram discuss why the certifications are so important for them and for the brand, the organization. This story series, a few screenshots of which are here, reiterates much of the information that's available on the brand website, telling the story of the brand's inception, Danica's ambition to build a company that gives back to the Indonesian community, and the Ibus, the women in the villages who have such valuable garment making skills and knowledge. So in addition to my interest in how the brand mobilizes their B Corp certification as a marketing tool and a sort of communication tactic, I was always also curious to look into how this branding intersects with their identity as a social enterprise. So an organization that combines enterprise activity with the generation of social benefits. In 2020, 4 years after the establishment of the brand in 2016, the company founded the Rumah Sukacita Foundation to scale their impact. So profits from the sale of Sukacita garments goes directly to the foundation, through which additional social support to the villages they work with is distributed. So in this way, the company enacts significant impact on the lives of the women and craftspeople it works with, by providing employment in the making phase of production, and then of course further support with the profit produced by the sale of these garments. So there's very much a kind of hand-in-hand nature to what they're doing. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear that. It's just started pouring with rain here. So on the topic of profits, it's worth noting here the cost of Sukacita garments, because I really think this comes back to my sort of concluding argument. So a couple of garments here, a blue cotton wrap dress printed with hand-drawn batik flowers is listed as about £215 or 450 Australian dollars. Or a raw cotton shirt with mother of pearl buttons there is listed for £134 or about 250 Australian dollars. So these prices might not seem outlandish to those of us who are familiar with buying from small businesses, ethical fashion brands, or social enterprises. However, they're also a marker of where Sukacita sits in the Indonesian market as a luxury brand out of reach for the majority of everyday Indonesians. When I spoke to Svida Alishabana, CEO of Femina Publishing Group and founder of Jakarta Fashion Week about this, she was adamant that the brand was not targeting Indonesian customers. Rather, she suggested that they're interested in attracting international and especially American consumers willing to pay these prices and familiar with what it means to be B Corp certified. And certainly the online presence of the brand is entirely in English. I mean, they do have the prices in Indonesian rupiah. Even when customers ask questions in the Instagram stories written in Bahasa Indonesian, the brand responds in English. When I asked Svida about whether she thought this market orientation had a role to play in the brand's desire to become B Corp certified, she was pretty unequivocal in her agreement. So she noted that while the brand is certainly committed to sharing Indonesian design, the way they've positioned themselves in the market suggests that they're most interested in attracting an international customer. So either expat Indonesians abroad or American consumers curious about traditional craft and aligned with the sustainable fashion movement. So if this is the case, then I think the potential impact of the brand and this certification can have on the growth of local ethical fashion sector in Indonesia and Southeast Asia is perhaps limited. Just to conclude briefly in this kind of overview of the brand, what I hope that this brief presentation has provided is, in the first instance, a sense of how accreditations such as B Corp can be really effectively mobilized as part of a branded marketing strategy, especially for an ethical social enterprise such as Sukacita. So there's been some research that suggests that brands are not confident about using the branding, but for this, in this case, I think we can see how effective it can be. However, in showing how this marketing is targeted to only a select, perhaps international audience, I also hope that the presentation has perhaps raised some questions about the role, purpose, and value of B Corp certification for the broader fashion industry. So not only are there established concerns about the greenwashing potential of verifications such as B Corp, and perhaps this comes back to the fact that you don't even have to have a 50% rate on the B impact scale. It's 80 out of 200, not 100 out of 200. But their role in advancing the cause for fashion, for business, for good, must also, I argue, be interrogated. So if these systems are only valuable for a global consumer already familiar with and able to afford such certified ethical fashion, then their value is perhaps far more limited than is required to transition the fashion system towards a more ethical, sustainable, and circular economy. So I'm going to finish up there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Richards. That was a really insightful look into Sukacita and how they are actually paving the way for other sustainable fashion brands from Southeast Asia. Next, I would like to introduce you to our second speaker, Singin. Singin is an independent writer and researcher who reimagines a fashion system guided by the principles of care and solidarity. By centering wardrobe stories and experiences, her practice highlights the possibility of appreciating, wearing, and discussing fashion in anti-commerce and de-hierarchization ways. She is a research and impact coordinator at the Fashion Pulpit, a Singapore-based clothes swapping platform. In 2022, her published work, Inside Our Wardrobe, a collaborative wardrobe study, was the organization's first impact report. Her second published work is a narrative-style interview series titled The Journal of Wear. She is currently the country coordinator for Fashion Revolution Singapore and also runs a wonderful advocacy platform on Instagram called No Ordinary Protest. Sing, now over to you.
Thank you, Akila. Thank you so much. I'm now going to share my screen. Yes. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on a Saturday evening or morning, wherever you are. My name is Singin. Like Akila mentioned, I am an independent writer and researcher who reimagines the fashion system through the work that I do. I have a background in fashion business and have an understanding for conversations around sustainable and ethical fashion from not just a business point of view, but also cultural and social perspectives. So in this presentation, I will discuss the alternative fashion spaces that exist beyond industrial and commercial spaces. I use the word spaces rather loosely, referring to mediums that carve out room for fashion to be thought about as wearer-centered activities, and also as physical, virtual, and imaginative realms that are created to prioritize care and introspection when it comes to understanding our relationship with fashion and our clothes. I'll be sharing in detail about these 3 projects that I've embarked on, from why and how they were conceived, and also to my personal reflections on them. Until April this year, I worked with the Fashion Pulpit, a local clothes swapping platform and circular fashion hub, and therefore number 1 and number 2 of these projects, so 2 out of these projects that I'll be sharing today were created with the support from the Fashion Pulpit, and the last project, Manifesto, is helmed by Fashion Revolution Singapore, where I volunteer as the organization's country coordinator. So I'll first talk about Inside Our Wardrobe. Inside Our Wardrobe was published in June 2022, where it is a research project hosted by the Fashion Pulpit and also supported by Singapore Sustainability Academy. The report investigates what we buy, what we own, and what we wear, and also throw away by gathering responses from 722 participants in a survey that also doubled up as a wardrobe audit. So Inside Our Wardrobe was really born out of wanting to expand what sustainable fashion means for the everyday wearer. It believes that for conversations around fashion sustainability to be all-inclusive and also to truly hold all downstream and upstream stakeholders accountable, we have to speak at length about the clothes that we love and also that we rewear, but also the clothes that we neglect and discard. So I'll just go through some of the spreads that are featured in the report. So these are just some general themes that we discussed, like wardrobe emotions. So like how respondents feel when they stand before their wardrobe, how would they describe their emotions? And also we spoke about the regularity of wear. So we had respondents count the total number of pieces they have in their wardrobe, and then how much of these pieces they wear regularly, how much they don't wear, what number is it that they don't wear as frequently, and also the ones that they've never worn before. So the dormants refer to the non-movers. So non-movers also refer to clothes that we used to wear a lot, but also not so much because of several reasons. So the report is split into 3 main chapters. We have reflect, review, and renew. And this follows the same sequence as the... All good? As the 30-minute survey that respondents had to complete. So in this process, we ask respondents and readers to return to the basic building blocks of how we are connected to the larger fashion system, which is through our wardrobes. Ultimately, inside our wardrobe is an invitation to start small and inwardly. It puts forward that when the broken fashion system feels too overwhelming to grasp and to fix, perhaps it is in the returning to it, to oneself, to one's wardrobe, where we begin to understand how clothes enter and leave the rotations of wear, whether permanently or temporarily. And this is the only way, or perhaps one of the few ways, that we can start creating ripples of change. In May 2023, the findings of the report were adapted into an exhibition that showcased the results through 6 artistic interpretations from local textile artists. So the exhibition is created and also produced by Renew Earth Sweatshop, an art project conceived in response to rethinking labor in fashion making. They are also recipients of the SG Eco Fund, and this week-long showcase is happening until tomorrow, the 7th of May, at Plaza Singapura, a mall in central Singapore. Next, I'll be speaking about Tijao, also known as the Journal of Wear. I call it Tijao just because the Journal of Wear is a mouthful. So Tijao is a narrative style 9-part interview series featuring clothes swappers from the fashion pulpit. So this series is one that I've created with fellow collaborator and writer Esther Cole. And in each entry, we speak to the interviewees from the premise of their home or a specific location that they pick. So instead of a simple Q&A format that's typically found in mainstream fashion magazines and also digital media platforms, we wrote in a narrative and continuous style to capture the wearer's unique voice and also their story from their perspectives and ours. So besides telling the stories of wear and clothing origin of the wearer, the writer's connection to fashion, garments, and also habits of wear is also simultaneously narrated. So these images are ones that we would feature in the profile on the blog, on the Fashion Pulpit's blog. And as you can see in the photos, the interviewers are also very much featured in the narrative. And on the right, you can see one of our profilers, one of our interviewees, who is showing us how she sort of stacks her trio of linen shirts that are of the same style but of different colorways on the same hanger. I would like to show you an example of what I mean. So this is one of the profiles that we've done recently that's published on the 27th of April on the Fashion Pulpit's blog. So this profile features Kai. Kai Sarah is actually a employee of the Fashion Pulpit and an ex-colleague of mine. And I titled her profile, "My Wardrobe is My Heart," because because I think her relationship with her clothes and also how she interacts with her style and her fashioning markers are very heartful and also very heartfelt. So these are the images that are featured in her blog post. So we have a photo of her wardrobe, a photo of her favorite sweater, and also a photo of the inside of her wardrobe door. So these are actually some affirmative notes that she's written for herself. And I think that was really interesting for me as an interviewer and as a writer who entered her space as both a friend, but also somewhat in a formal setting, where the wardrobe is not just a vessel for us to hold our clothes, but also really reflective of some of the most intimate parts of ourselves. So these are just some examples that I've taken, snippets from the interview. So the bolded parts are taken from her dialogue that I've transcribed into the interview. Yeah, just quickly go through them. Yes, so looking back on how the project was conceived, Tijao is really a response to the workings of a hyper-editorial fashion landscape. Instead of thinking about the must-have items that we want people to buy, it really centers on the humanity of the wearer themselves. So it captures the nuance of our relationship with our clothes and also highlights how everyday clothes are incorporated into our lives. So next, I'll be speaking about Manifesto. Manifesto is a online original digital zine that is published by Fashion Revolution Singapore just last Saturday on the 29th of April, the last week of Fashion Revolution Week. So this year, we received 2,000 euros in funding from Fashion Revolution and the Lords Foundation to publish Manifesto in response to the theme for Fashion Revolution Week this year, which is Manifesto for Fashion Revolution, which is a 10-point manifesto that is published back in 2018 on both the Fashion Revolution website, but also on all of their social platforms. You can have a read in detail, in full, of the 10 points. I'm not going to go through them now because then I'll run out of time. So you can either do that on their website or download our zine, and it's also on there. I would also like to give you a bit of background of what Fashion Revolution Singapore is. So we are the local chapter of the global movement that's formed after the Rana Plaza collapse in Dhaka, Bangladesh in 2013. And this collapse resulted in 1,100 deaths and 2,500 injuries, making it one of history's worst industrial incidents. So with the funding that we received from Lord Foundation, we were able to financially compensate our contributors and also collaborate very closely with a Singaporean designer and editor, Ian, who created the beautiful graphics of the zine. So the QR code on here is how you can access the zine. It's completely open source, free to access. You can either scan the QR code or go on our Instagram, and it's linked in our bio. So Manifesto is a project that's conceived out of a love for fashion. And it aims to sort of capture this love that's easily felt on some days, but elusive on others, and how this births very thoughtful observations of the fashion system. In the zine, you will find 10 stories of love clothes, everyday clothes, new clothes, clothes used as means to raise funds for mutual aid, clothes that exist in, I guess, factory floors as mass manufactured products, and also non-clothes that exist as artistic interpretations of material and also tools for storytelling. It seeks to differentiate the conversations around sustainability of fashion that's led by institutions and mainstream media outlets with words like green, eco-friendly, and quote-unquote made from recycled materials. And like Inside Our Wardrobe, the first project I shared, it aims to diversify and expand the way we perceive fashion sustainability in Singapore, the region, and also beyond. I will now share some examples of the stories that are featured in Manifesto. So we have I'll Make It Myself, a crochet poem by Tegan Smith. Tegan is based in Hong Kong, and this poem is not just a poem, it's a crochet poem because it's written in a 12-syllable rhyming scheme. And with crochet, she visually represented the lines of the poem where each color is a rhyming scheme and each stitch represents a word in each line. So you can read this in detail in the zine. And then we also have Solidarithrift by Irie Arman. So Irie is one half of Solidarithrift, which is a collective that organizes pop-up thrift markets to raise funds for mutual aid organizations. So Solidarithrift's comic illustration highlights alternative fashion economies that are built on concepts of abundance and also ones that celebrate the joys of buying secondhand, and also platforms the patronage of secondhand, I guess, spaces as means of solidarity. Small is Beautiful by Esther Cole offers a reframing of ourselves as desiring subjects through personal recollections of shopping small. And then we have Sarong Cycle by Nadia Ferdi, which features an overview of the sarong used as various forms of worn garments, and also interview snippets of the artist with her family members and also their experience with the sarong. We have Beyond Bindis and Binaries by Aditi Shivarama Krishnan, which looks at the intricate relationship between her shifting identities and also her loved fashion objects. Through her documentation, fashion is a vehicle for exploration, self-expression, and also wayfinding through the world. Last but not least, we have Junk Joy, a collaborative response from Adele Ng and Hazira Basri, where they adopted mediums of AI art and also hand-woven sculptures to imagine new forms of healing and being. So these stories really deviate from the conventional ways of perceiving fashion as hype or as trendy must-haves, and instead really exploring how fashion is intertwined and interconnected with the planet and all human and non-human lives. Manifesto, the zine, dreams of a culture where desire is not to fulfill lack or lack of, but is seen as small human ways of yearning and engaging with the self and the world. So I would like to end off my presentation with this last slide. And you might have noticed that I removed the quotation marks on spaces, because I hope that through my presentation and through the three projects that I've shared, we sort of see this common thread that weaves through the three separate and also independent projects that are independent of each other, but really that are based from a place of love and care, and are not just wearer-centered activities, but are really realms, both physical, virtual, and even imaginative spaces that are created to prioritize care and introspection. So that's it from me. Thank you so much. You can find me at No Ordinary Protest on Instagram. I haven't updated in a while, but they will be coming. And you can also follow Fashion Revolution Singapore on Instagram to find our zine. Thank you so much.
Hello, and thanks for that wonderful session. I'm going to now chair the second session of the day. And thank you so much, first of all, for joining us for that session, which is entitled Fashion Spreads, as part of the Front and Off Centre Fashion in Southeast Asia at the Courtauld Research Forum Day 2. My name, as the chair, is Anne Pearson-Smith, and I'm Professor of Fashion at Northumbria University. In fact, I lived and worked for over 30 years until recently in Southeast Asia and in Hong Kong in particular, where much of my fashion research and teaching was done, where I took in that work a very sort of decentered, decolonial approach to examining transglobal fashion, especially fashion brand storytelling, sustainable fashion and circularity, and new style trends such as cosplay. I'm also associate editor of the Journal of Fashion, Style and Pop Culture. So I'm really happy to be here today as your chair for this session. And it's a very exciting and timely research conference. So first up, I'd like to introduce our first presenter, who is Rima Febriani. Rima is currently teaching at the Department of Literature and Cultural Studies at the University of Padjadjaran, Indonesia. She received her master's degree in Cultural Studies from Universitas Indonesia after completing her bachelor's in English at University of Padjadjaran. She's published 2 journal articles and translated Keith Fulcher's Social Commitment in Literature and the Arts, the Indonesian Institute of People's Culture 1950 to 1965, which she published in 2020 with Pustaka Pias. Her current research focuses on the production of sexual knowledge in post-colonial Indonesia, which includes ideas and issues such as modernity, morality, obscenity, and family. So Rima is going to present on Modest and Appropriate for Us, Fashion, Modernity, and Morality in Post-Colonial Indonesia, 1950 to 1965. Rima, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pearson-Smith, for the lovely introductions. Good afternoon, everyone who's in the GMT +7 and 8. Today I'm going to, so let me share my screen first. Okay, so this presentations is based on my reading of popular sources from 1960 to 1965. It is a short 15 years period, but also crucial in the national building in Indonesia. But at the same time, it is also overlooked in the mainstream national historiography due to political tension, and also it is also part of my project to search for the formations of sexual knowledge in post-colonial Indonesia. So many things happening, so many things went on during the era. We have 1955 Bandung Conference. We have tensions, and also it opens with optimism as well. So the 1950s, despite a series of upheaval and reconstruction after the Revolutionary War, as Adrian Vickers notes, was the era in which they almost created Indonesia as a strong new nation. It also witnessed the collapse of two strong classes, the European ruling class and the indigenous aristocrats, and saw the birth of a new class of Western educated nationalists. And this new class was the one who promoted modernity in the new state. So also in the intellectual and artistic scenes, the primary national goal relied on cultural project. And as Lindsay said, to be an Indonesian was to be modern. But the references expanded, particularly to the US, and also to look other countries such as China and Eastern European countries. So somehow this became an arena where foreign values were both embraced and also demonized, and tradition norms were celebrated and also renounced. Morality was one of the main issues, as Western values also sometimes deemed immoral or taboo, and many people would prefer Western arts, clothes, languages, lifestyles, technologies, and universal ideas. Men and women dress and behave more cosmopolitan in orientations. And also there's a note about the paradox of this dynamic new society, that as new spirit for mobility and at the same time longing for rootedness and stability to face that mobility. But at the same time, the opposite of the optimism, there's also a problem with pessimism and a critic, especially in terms of the problem with declining moral. Magazines, newspapers, films, music, new lifestyles, and pulp fictions were thriving during the era, as influx of foreign influences manifested in everyday life in this new state. We can read an example in films, which is a highly celebrated yet also precarious form of art, such as Tiga Dara. It is about three sisters who were raised by their grandmother after their mother's death, and an absentee father who has to deal with the changing in their society. The oldest sister here, Nono, is represented as represents the traditional norms in both in her attire and her way of thinking. And the modernity was represented by the more spirited sister Nana, the one on the right. And even though modernity was highly promoted, writer Pramudia Anantatur did not share the same optimism. He particularly concerned about the declining moral, as he observed in the city of Jakarta. In one of his short stories, Mrs. Veterinary Dr. Suharko, he criticized the modern era through his comparison between Dr. Suharko's European wife, Kori, and his new young wife, Kiki. Suharko, devastated by the collapse of his profession that relied on European leisure, had to live with the energetic, lively, and free-spirited Kiki, who modernizes their house with the latest technology and furniture that she consulted through women's magazines. This new look makes Suharko longs for the old days with Kori, as he was used to slow living life. So there is also the problem with people concerned about the problem with obscenity too, particularly as people adopted Western popular lifestyles. that were imported through media. And okay, so women particularly became even more visible on the streets as they found more freedom in expressing their individual and communal goal. They were also provided with sources of knowledge as the number of literacy grew. Indonesian media experienced a boom during the era with more diverse readership. It was highly influential, where miscellaneous ideas, including fashion, encountered and incited the public. Northrop briefly notes that as many women in post-colonial settings, traditional dresses were embraced as part of Indonesian identity. In Indonesia, Princess Karno encouraged the return of sarong and kebaya in many colors among the Indonesian elites. So I'm going to take example for this presentation from two prominent magazines at the time, Wanita and Keluarga. Yeah, Wanita, as the name indicates, which means woman, is for woman. And in its early issues, fashion was treated on utility base and discourses in articles, such as which colors were suitable for Indonesian women, or how they compared to general wives that represent modernity and traditional values in their attire, or when men contributors also gave their opinions in Indonesian woman fashion, in which they saw women blindly follow the Lana Lobel's guidance. And it's also, we can see here that the next one is, Wanita is managed by Pujiati Youngbrod. She's the wife of Armin Pane, and also Siwati Tawahulan, wife of Indonesian former Foreign Minister Ruslan Abdul Ghani. And the second one is Keluarga, which means family in Indonesian. But even though the tagline says that it is for mothers, fathers, and children, it is more about, it is intended, of course, for women as the homemakers for the article. So you can see that Woman magazine at the time is less glossy, very, and they take references from Western fashion. So this is the first, actually the first fashion spread in Wanita magazine. They took the example from Ebony magazines. So they took the reference. This is for holiday to the beach. So that the title says simple, attractive, and there's a repeated word of sesuai here. And also this is for a young woman for evening and afternoon and evening dresses. That the word sesuai was used repeatedly when they in many fashion spreads. So sesuai can be translated as appropriate, which refers to modesty. Also fitting, that refers to weather, occasions, or skin tone and body figures. But it also can mean seemly, that means following the good taste. So during the era, Indonesian fashion was highly influenced by, especially from Western magazines, from Europe, from European countries, or from the USA. So fashion spread in the 1950s to 1965 majorly were not as we have seen today. That but it's more like taking examples or taking references from other countries. So, and also this is the era where women took the streets in activisms or working, and secretaries is one of the most popular jobs for Indonesian women at the time. And this is from Wanita magazines that they focus on, and the words this way also repeatedly appear here, that it should be sopan or modest for us and appropriate. That modesty means that skirt should be mid-length, and no, you can see means a sleeveless dress. It is an Indonesian term for sleeveless blouses or sleeveless cut. So it should also be simple with no bright colors, and it also should be unpretentious, and that even the woman went out to work, they have to keep it low profile. That there should be a neat and it should be clean, which is different from the clothing that the clothes that you wear at home. So and they also should show professionalism here. And this is from Universal, which means that they took examples from American sources, that they actually took the references from there. And also this is from European influences, especially French, which is hailed as the center for fashion, and also West Germany as a center for industry. And this one is French style, and this is the Germany. This is from Majalah Keluarga magazine, and from the German they took example from film Unfrau. So the both examples are represented by two strong countries, two strong European countries in terms of fashion scene. And also they didn't forget about the motherhood and the return of femininity, as in the Western, as the Western woman also returned to home after the World War II. Motherhood, domesticity were still important for Indonesian, modern Indonesian women in the 1950s. So this is for this is a spread for maternity. They also again took examples from, this is from Elle, and this is from Maison de Blanc in French. This is from, and this one, the other one is from Film Unfrau again. So motherhood is celebrated as a happiness, and with smile, with laughter, and also with softness. And it celebrates, and they suggest that these dresses can be worn for evening tea with their husbands or accepting evening guests. So they still so different from the working attire fashion for mothers, or fashion for domestic women, were portrayed more. We portray with the quote unquote true femininity. But the terms modesty also also applies in many different patterns too. That sleeveless dress sometimes was considered, many times were considered as obscene for Indonesian context. But here we can see this is for this is a spread for Christmas evening dresses, that it's okay to wear a sleeveless dress for Christmas occasions, and they and it's not the modesty that become the concern for this dress, but more of the cold weather if you wear such dress. And also the president at the time, President Sukarno, encouraged the return of sarung and kebaya for the public, that more women should wear them in public. In the late colonial era, sarung and kebaya were were prohibited for European women, as they feared that it made them become closer to the native people. But now, but in the 1950s, it is encouraged. But it also has, but sarung and kebaya was treated more in strict rules. In this one, we can see that a woman wearing sarung and kebaya with the suggested hairband, reading Western magazine, and also kebaya and sarung, though celebrated, they also criticized because they didn't accommodate mobility, women's mobility in the modern time. And the ones in the above is baju bodo. Is from Sulawesi, which is looser in cut, and you can also see that there were, while sarung kebaya were celebrated in more stricter rule, baju bodo was celebrated with modification, with adjustment, with more colors. This is how traditional dresses were treated and defined in a different way. In most colonial settings, traditional dresses were celebrated. Women wore traditional dresses as part of their national identity, but for sarung kebaya, there's the cut, the tighter cut did not support a woman's movements, which was actually peak in the 1950s.
Rima, just to say you have 2 minutes left.
Okay, this is from my last slide. There are actually many things that they can be explored from Indonesian fashion in the early years of independence, because the fashion was at the time was treated more of a necessities, how to sew dresses, how to fix dresses. It is a job that it is a woman's job to master it. And references came all the way from Western countries. There's both embrace and also embrace for their practicality, as opposed to traditional dresses, and also for their neatness, and also for their clean cut, for their simplicity. But in the spirit of anti-imperialism, it was also condemned for introducing obscenity, especially in women's dresses. So, meanwhile, the traditional dresses itself did not accommodate swift movements. There are critics for example, in beauty pageants, and also critics for promoting Western fashion for middle-class women, and the late and it also showed the difference between the late colonial fear of unfamiliarity, that they don't want to embrace the unfamiliarity, but in the post-colonial Indonesia, they embraced the unfamiliarity with their own adjustments. So I think there are many things actually that can be explored if we read more sources. For example, this is during the 1950s, there were protests about women wear sleeveless dress in the streets. That students in Yogyakarta actually held a protest that encouraged the government to stop them from wearing that. So I think I should end my presentation now. Thank you for your time. I hope there are inputs and questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rima. We'll take questions at the end, and thank you for such a fascinating presentation on the various interpretations of modernity in post-colonial Indonesia and how it was expressed through fashion and style and lifestyle. So thank you very much for that. I just want to note here to the audience that Dr. Alice Beard, who is meant to be also presenting in this session, is unable to join us today for her presentation. So I'd like now to go on to introduce our next speaker, who is Angeline Wong, who's a doctoral candidate at the School of Art, Design and Media at Nanyang Technological University. Angeline is also a dance practitioner, which is important for this presentation as well. She holds a master's in fashion studies from the New School Parsons in New York, which she achieved in 2019. And since 2020, she's also taught at the School of Fashion, LaSalle College of Art. Her research interest is in the intersections of fashion, performance, and theory. Her doctoral thesis employs this intersection to understand fashion modeling practices in post-colonial Singapore. Most recently, she's the co-author of Fashion Identity Image in 2022, and her dance film Plie was screened at the Fashion on Displays exhibition entitled The Soul of Things in 2022. So Angeline, over to you to present on an archive of poses decolonializing Singapore's fashion industry through performing models' images. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, for that kind introduction and for that wonderful presentation, Rima. Today, I'll be presenting an archive of poses decolonizing Singapore's fashion history through performing models' images, which touches on the research that I've been doing for my PhD thesis. I came to the question of the Singaporean fashion model because of two main interests: the performing body, which is derived from my background as a dancer, and Singapore's fashion history, which I have been researching as part of a project with the National University of Singapore and the National Heritage Board. There is a bubbling interest in Singapore's fashion history, such as in our organizer Nadia's brief introduction to her own PhD thesis yesterday. However, there remains the question of the body and the untold story of the fashion model in Singapore. I argue that the question of the body should be central to answering the question of Asian feminine identity. My research today covers the history of fashion modeling in Singapore from the 1950s through looking at newspaper and magazine articles, together with a visual analysis of the fashion spreads from 1965 to 1987 in Singapore. I attend to two questions. What was the rise of the Singaporean fashion model? And how did the pose as embodied performance show her negotiations of national and feminine identities? Aside from the historical context that I cover from the 1950s, I chose to analyze fashion spreads from 1965 to 1987 because 1965 was when Singapore became independent after its separation from Malaysia. Prior to this, Singapore was a crown colony. Thus, the period after independence was an intense time of increasing Singapore's cultural capital as a means of survival. I chose 1987 as the bookend because 1987 marks a time when Singapore's fashion industry had achieved some maturity, with annual fashion weeks and the Singaporean supermodel having made her mark on the global fashion industry. Prominent Singaporean models then were already beginning to exit their roles and venture into other careers. I would like to preface my presentation with two quotes, first from Turner and Chung regarding the Asian body. They write, "Different cultural traditions produce different types of embodiment. In turn, different forms of embodiment reinforce different cultural traditions. Against this notion of the separateness of the body in Asia and the body in the West, we are going through a very deep process of globalization, which means that national cultures become increasingly hybrid, thereby embracing different body techniques as a consequence. The mixture of body cultures produces new forms of embodiment. These body techniques can also be capitalized on, such as in the world of fashion modeling. To this, I quote Ashley Mears, who argues, by working on the body, models are producing a new self, not just a physical surface. They are crafting sets of feelings and dispositions as well, what Pierre Bourdieu calls habitus. The question of the Singaporean fashion model acts on these perspectives and addresses the issues of embodiment with regard to Asianness, capital, and femininity. Early coverage of fashion modeling in Singapore's mainstream media portrayed modeling as an activity that women of leisure did. In the 1950s, models, then called mannequins, were occasional persons of interest in the general Singaporean public in terms of where they were traveling and who they were marrying. Models traveling to Singapore made news, such as, quote, Pretty Miss Joyce Parsons, and, quote, a London model who came to Singapore to marry the manager of Fraser and Neave Malacca, W.H. Chowns. It was reported that, I quote, the slightest whisper of haute couture never fails to thrill Singapore, and Miss Parsons was a top-ranking Deauville model in London for 3 years until she flew out to Singapore 3 weeks ago for the wedding, end quote. Women of leisure who combined travel with marriage and modeling, and who were furthermore celebrated in Singapore's newspapers, exemplify the class politics behind the aspirations of Singaporeans who were transitioning from British colonial rule. The women turned their leisure time into acts of aesthetic labor and set up feminine ideals for the Singaporean reading audience. The Singaporean audience was thus primed for the establishment of modeling as a lucrative industry. One of the most effective strategies for formalizing and popularizing the modeling profession in Singapore was the establishment of modeling schools and agencies. These agencies and schools would assist in nudging mainstream discourse of fashion models beyond the bubble of the leisure class to a career accessible to more women. The first iteration of these schools were charm schools set up in the 1950s, catering to a largely female audience and offering courses in deportment, dressing, social etiquette, and fitness. These courses culminated in diploma certificates and professional modeling opportunities for some students. The curriculum nurtured qualities derived from feminine ideals, represented by fashion mannequins and pageant queens. One of the most notable charm schools in Malaya was Mannequin Training and Charm School, opened in 1956 by London-trained professional models Joan Booty and Ruth Warner. Thereafter, many modeling schools were set up to cater to this growing demand for modeling classes well into the 1980s. Thus, modeling schools and agencies facilitated not only the cultivation and monetization of physical and their implied moral ideals on the institutional level, but enabled such ideals to trickle down into everyday lives of women through modeling classes. As conspicuous consumption became more commonplace in Singapore, fashion modeling also became more central to advertising as an indicator of a more cosmopolitan society. Photographic modeling became an option as a part-time job in 1957, particularly for undergraduate students. Professional opportunities, however, remained limited because prominent clothing manufacturers did not have a base in Singapore and thus did not demand Singaporean models. But by 1959, these models were reportedly meeting the increasing demands of advertising and commercials. The greater attraction of models' salaries and a higher demand for modeling classes prompted Singapore Model Academy to increase its class offerings from twice a week to 5 times a week with 2 sessions per day to cater to working women in 1960. With these options in place, modeling was not only seen as a form of self-development for students on holiday, but modeling as a prospective career or part-time job became commonplace by 1968. In the 1960s, the fashion model embodied the paradoxes of the changing landscape around Asian and feminine identity. Her increased global mobility and earning capacity intertwined with her superior bodily discipline and performance of femininity that appeased the Oriental and male gazes. In 1967, Singaporean model Faith modeled for Pierre Cardin. She was in Germany modeling British students' designs when Cardan spotted her for her, quote, tiny-boned gracefulness, precise features, and sleek dark hair, end quote. Cardan renamed her Anak and booked her to model in Paris and Rome. Anak, with her doe eyes, pixie cut, and small frame, conformed to the Twiggy physique. Yet her being Singaporean contextualizes her work quite differently, as she represents a Singaporean interpretation of fashionable ideals at the time. Her success in the international fashion industry is colored by her initial distance from it, and thus the success lies in her own adaptation to the learned standards while maintaining a sense of exoticism in Western eyes. Like Anak, fashion designer and model Vicky Dutton, pictured on the right, embodied values that hybridized Asian exoticism, pandering to the male gaze while balancing female autonomy. She was renowned for adding a zip to the Malay sarong for easier wear, and she ran a fashion salon in Singapore where she taught her pupils deportment. Despite her career success and her strong influence on other Malay women, this article in September 1965 focused on her romantic relationships, particularly her second marriage to British agent Danny Dutton. Vicky Dutton's story encapsulates women's greater freedom to fashion themselves, as well as the valorization of the white man and the fashioning of the body towards contemporary needs of mobility and the exotic gaze. Vicky Dutton's salon was also an early example of the increased demand for career women who maintained a sense of that so-called essential femininity. One reason for the high demand was because of the hotel boom in Singapore that needed more workers in hospitality. This essential femininity that used to qualify the subordinate woman in the domestic sphere had now been repackaged for the career woman. Bodily discipline became a form of empowerment and an indicator of modernity. Now we turn to analyze the model's poses. The models in her world from 1965 to 1966 mimicked mannequins in their poses. Their overall bodily conduct was precise and rigid, with repetitive poses that echo the standardization of the feminine body that fashion theorist Caroline Evans argues occurs in the early 20th century. Evans argues the streamlined modernist bodies of the mannequins parading in the couture houses and resorts of the 1920s resembled the rationalized body that also figured in the realms of work, leisure, and art. In the fashion show, commerce and culture meshed. Economic values became cultural as they were grafted onto women's bodies, which in turn acquired a value that was both economic and symbolic. Though Evans was referring to 1919 to 1929, her theory on standardized fashion modeling as an embodiment of Fordism and its contradiction with the New Woman is still applicable to our reading of the fashion models in the 1960s. Models often looked directly at the camera, slightly past the camera, or 45 degrees away, usually with the chin tilted downwards. The most common facial expression is a small and understated smile with bright eyes and a slight raise in the cheeks and corners of the lips. This conforms to what Evans calls the industrial smile. The trunk of the body would either be upright or the model would lean slightly back. The models hold their arms with slight tension, mostly beside their torsos. The model's fingers also hold slight tension and are thoughtfully placed. The index finger would be slightly longer than the other fingers, similar to a mannequin's, where the extent to which the fingers can be bent is limited. The fingers may be lightly placed on the thigh, hip, or on an imaginary shelf next to the model. The approach to leg placement is similarly delicate. Mostly, the weight is placed more on one foot so as to accentuate the hip. The frontal knee is bent and crossed over the back knee to close the space between the legs. This creates an enhanced hourglass figure, especially when the model wears a long skirt. The foot bearing less weight is always beveled, that is, with the ankle leaning inwards and the toes pointing outwards. This form of standardization and rigidity is an embodiment of both industrialization and the new Singaporean woman. The poses mimicked European fashion models while being adapted for the Singaporean fashion industry, thus demonstrating the simultaneous influence of the West and the assertion of creative agency. In this way, the models demonstrated Singapore's aspirations as it emerged as an independent nation state. The 1970s in Singapore were characterized by an increased fashion consciousness and the women's liberation movement. perhaps best encapsulated in the fact that 1975 was the first International Women's Year declared by the United Nations, while Balmain showed in Singapore for the first time in December 1974, then Christian Dior in March 1975. Fashion was accessed by a wider public, with the shift from haute couture to ready-to-wear by the Western fashion industry, particularly in the US and Italy. This greater fashion consciousness led more women to invest in their appearances, thus opening the conversation on the right way to groom oneself. At the same time, Singapore saw its own fashion models gaining success overseas. Models, more local ones as compared to previous decades, became valorized figures. Modeling and grooming courses and modeling competitions hosted by Her World and Female became commonplace, giving women new professional possibilities and more chances to travel out of Singapore. More Singaporean models were featured in magazines and newspapers, creating an aura around the homegrown fashion model. Mei Ling Chan, who worked as a professional model since 1962, was called the Singapore girl who made good because she first modeled for Her World before going to Hong Kong to further her career and eventually traveled around Europe. She was described as, quote, attractive, very oriental, not strictly beautiful, end quote. Orientalism was a desired aesthetic trait in Asian models. Similar to Mei Ling, Carrie Wong was lauded for her look that combined exotic Easternness and fashionable Westernness. She was described as such. Carrie is the essence of Oriental mystic and Western chic. Models like Carrie Wong and Mei Ling Chan were still rare. Several photographers for Singaporean publications were interviewed, and the general sentiment was that the Singaporean models were not up to standard because they were not well chosen or well trained by the agencies, and implied that the generally low pay for Singaporean models substantiated the standard. What gave models like Carrie success? Possibly her ability to evoke an edgy coolness that was different from the earlier nymphet mannequins of the 1960s. We see the cool girl emerge to the forefront of modeling and the first glimpses of the figure of the Singaporean supermodel. There is a greater focus on length, line, and glamour. The cool girl emerges with a forlorn look, looking away from the camera, or a bored and daring gaze towards the camera, her arms relaxed, she slouches. We see this with Carrie, who posed as if she did not care. In this spread, Carrie is seated for 2 out of the 3 images. In the first one, she wears a skirt and high heels. Her legs are spread hip-width apart. Her hands are placed on her thighs to push one shoulder higher than the other so that her torso curves asymmetrically as she looks off to the side coquettishly. In her other seated pose, she is profiled to the side with one leg bent behind the other. She places her elbow on the table behind her and slouches into her seat. Again, one shoulder is higher than the other, which differs from the mannequin-like propriety of the 1960s poses. With the sunglasses, the look of uncaring is complete. This coolness captures the zeitgeist of women's greater freedoms, but it is also commodified amidst an increasingly globalized fashion industry in Singapore that is working towards being recognized as the fashion hub for tourists. This coolness was combined with role-playing in fashion spreads where the characters reflected the real lives of Singaporean women. Here we see the emphasis on height, given the low angle of the camera that allows the exaggeratedly long legs. The models in Chic Economy, Angie and Carol, appear engaged in work in a printing room where they choose colors and check printed copies of magazines. In the 2 larger images, the models lean their shoulders back, legs positioned to give a slight lift to the hips, and they adopt confident and unbothered expressions as they assess their materials. They are more preoccupied with their work than with the camera. Next, in the 1980s were defined by a coming of age of the Singapore fashion industry with annual national and international fashion showings and the establishment of several household names in fashion modeling, such as Pat Crowell, Nora Arifin, Ethel Fong, and Hannes Saini, among several others. These models established careers in Europe and the US, modeling for brands like Givenchy, YSL, and Jean-Louis Cherche, and had high earnings. For example, Hannes would earn 80,000 francs or Singapore dollars 27,000 then per season, which is 2 months long. A standard for modeling was also established, as seen in this diagram with Ethel Fong. Evidently, modeling had become highly competitive and a cutthroat industry. Gender norms were comfortably challenged, such as in this spread with harness, where she props her leg up defiantly in a pantsuit. She also maintains a sense of femininity through her angling of the shoulders and the hips. Her versatility as a model is representative of her versatility between gendered actions. The poses in the 1980s, like the modeling career, became very dramatic. There was a focus on angular and long lines. Fists were placed on hips that were exaggeratedly pushed out to one side. Square shoulders were emphasized. Chins were cocked or tilted downwards like the 1970s cool girl, except now it expressed more maturity and confidence. This spread of Nora and harness in Paris represents the high fashion Singaporean model taking up space in the fashion capital of the world. As they stand poised and as they angle their bodies in ways that make their high fashionability perceivable to us, we can see that a hierarchy of Singaporean fashionability has not only been established, but has matured. The Singaporean fashion model speaks the same language as the Western fashion system. However, I would like to point out a paradox, because though it may seem that these models' success depended on their assimilation into Euro-America, models like Harness and Pat expressed how, when in Paris, they had a leg up against the European models because of their rigorous training in Singapore during their time in modeling courses. Their trainers would have mostly learned the trade in London or from fashion media. Therefore, we see this transnational exchange of ideas regarding bodily discipline that complicates the narrative of simple assimilation. These models' success was about localized disciplining and then the application and creative adaptation for audiences of different geographies, a sort of bodily code switching. Through a snapshot of spreads I have shown today, I hope to have demonstrated how looking closely at the model's bodily performances can reveal an alternative narrative. Despite the narrative of Singapore's models having made it because of their success in Euro-America, their poses tell a much more complex and clouded story of negotiating transnational ideals. To end, I'd like to point out a couple of areas I have not been able to attend to in this short presentation. First, a deeper look into the impact of Orientalism and ethnicization on the model's poses. And second, the influence of specific designer styles on their poses. These I hope to address in the future. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. And thank you for joining us. If you are for the first time for Front and Off Center, Fashion in Southeast Asia at the Kotor Research Forum. My name is Nadia Wang. I'm the organizer of this wonderful conference with all these amazing speakers we've had so far. I can't wait for the rest of it. I'm also a lecturer at LaSalle College of the Arts Singapore and the editor of Fashion and Market. I will be the chairperson for this 7th session featuring the PHX Fashion Group as a case study of collectives in the Southeast Asian fashion community. We will first have a group presentation and then open for questions. If you have any of them, please type into the chat box anytime and we will get to them at the end. We're going to do this session a little differently from the previous ones and have the presenters each introduce themselves. We have Esme Palaganas, Joseph Bagasao, and Tricky Lopa. Over to you guys.
Right. Good day to everyone, and thank you, Nadia, and everyone who's joining us today as we talk about PHX and what we do in the fashion and creative ecology in the Philippines. So just to introduce ourselves first, I'm Esme Palaganas. I am a creative entrepreneur. I am a lecturer and consultant and one of the co-founders of the PHX Fashion Group, together with Tricky Lopa and Steph Bagasao. Steph?
Good morning, everyone. I am Joseph Bagasao, and I am the founder and designer of Bagasao. It's a ready-to-wear brand based in Manila, and I am also the co-founder of PHX Fashion Group.
Good morning, everybody, and good evening from scorching Manila. As the co-founder of Art Fair Philippines and Art in the Park, my involvement with the creative industries is really with the visual arts, but I came on board as a supporter of young fashion labels, as an advisor for the PHX Fashion Group initially. think we'll turn over to Esme to tell the PHX Fashion Group's story.
So we are PHX Fashion Group, and we are founded to propel Filipino brands to a global level through different initiatives that we will talk later on today. So just to give a brief background of how this all started, the whole idea was concepted through conversations with designers on how we can be prepared for the demands of the global industry as designers residing in the Philippines. So I started as a designer myself, together with Seth. He's a contemporary. And even though we have different resources online, we know that there are so many publications that talk about the business of fashion. There's never a perspective in of where we stand in Southeast Asia, in the Philippines. So especially in this industry where we always look for the new kids on the block, there are very few programs exist to support the new to become established. So in a one Granary article titled "Hyping Isn't Helping," there is proof that there is a need for a space, a platform to grow up and learn to be long-term brands. And this is what we aim to offer through PHX events. These projects and initiatives vary from education programs through workshops and conferences, incubation programs, and market weeks. And the very first event that we want to share to you is our inaugural event, which actually came about through an opportunity to bring Japanese fashion professionals to Manila to talk about gaining entry to the fashion market in Japan. So this is our first event, and PHX Fashion Conference was held in 2019 and was the first of its kind in the country. So we worked with the Department of Trade and Industries and other affiliated groups. And as you can see here, we did have a variety of subjects to talk about, from intellectual property, from expert costing and pricing on a Philippine perspective, different fashion ecosystems. And of course, the main event of this conference was doing business in Japan discussions, where we brought in different speakers from Tokyo and its fashion market. And to top it all off, we had a portfolio review by a Tokyo-based showroom and agency called H3O Tokyo. And of course, we were already planning in 2020 for our next iterations of the PHX Fashion Conference, but we all know what happened during that year. So in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic, our plans, and especially the whole world, actually had, we kind of had a change up. And the fashion industry was severely impacted and was also deemed as a non-essential industry. And we felt the need to bring together the community we fostered in our first event to an online gathering where we can talk about the directions of the industry as we move post-pandemic. So as part of the Fashion Design Council of the Philippines, we had discussions with its president on how we can
talk to each other, and we did set up this event in the early days of the pandemic. This is May 2020, and it was the first few events that tackled being prepared after this whole thing. So with a theme centered in change, reality, and community, we discussed the directions the fashion world will take and how we can be ready for its next iteration. So this will set, of course, the course of what we will do next. And this is something my colleagues will talk about in a bit.
So we organized our second event, Philippine PHX Fashion Conversations, in August 2020. At that time, Manila was still under strict lockdown, but already things were a bit more optimistic compared to when we organized our first event. Fashion labels started to realize that they could, to use a 2020 buzzword, pivot their operations and carry on despite the pandemic still looming large over all of us. So next slide, over 2 Saturdays, we worked with 2 branding agencies, Monday Off and Serious Studio. Monday Off facilitated a panel discussion with independent fashion labels on a brand guide to the new normal to really prepare for the world after the pandemic. While Serious Studio, the other branding agency we worked with, did an online session of their advice column. They had a very popular advice, sort of an advice outlet for brands called Dear Serious. And again, this provided an opportunity to connect and learn from members of the fashion community. Next slide. Okay, we actually had about 500 people signing up for these online sessions of ours. And we felt, again, we serve the purpose of bringing together the community, especially for the emerging fashion labels. Okay, so let me turn you over to Seth for our last 2 online events.
So just to give you a brief background, so from our conference in 2019, 8 designers were selected to go through 8-month mentorship. And the mentorship was really about helping the designers present their brands and collection to select group of media and buyers from stores like Isetan, Beams, and Mitsukoshi in Japan. We have invited 3 industry professionals to talk and reflect, if I may say, who, what, and why, how mentorship can contribute to the success of a fashion creative. And how does one really navigate the good, the bad, and the ugly side of the industry? Being a mentee has helped them create a strong backbone through different people before them, directly and indirectly. And now, as they have become the other side of the coin, being able to help the next generation by guiding them through the pitfalls of building a fashion business. From the talk is how mentorship can help create a healthy ecosystem in fashion. And this is the way forward that is very, very vital. And so 8 months after the talk about mentorship, we had the PHX fashion preview. At that time, it was still the height of the lockdown and no one could travel to Tokyo for the showroom event. So we have decided to invite 8 designers who went through the mentorship, and we've also invited 4 industry professionals as panelists. I think as a group, as PHX group, it is very important for us to provide a platform that can create a dialogue with the designers themselves and see their process creatively and show that the collection doesn't grow from trees. Talking about their process of turning ideas into actual garment on the selling floor and the whole business behind it. And through this preview, we were also able to get a glimpse of the collection that they have worked hard for, or they send them to. And as you can see in the slide right now, this is the actual showroom in Shibuya, Tokyo, where they have presented 25 looks and that features women's wear, menswear, and accessories. And now for our next event, we have the PHX Maarte.
So in August of 2022, we were finally allowed to have live events. And I must say we came back with a bang. Just to give a brief background, Maarte is a bazaar that is organized by the Museum Foundation of the Philippines. This is the group that supports the National Museum and its network that has been in existence since 2009, primarily first to support indigenous textiles, later on growing to support Philippine arts and crafts. In its comeback edition last year, we presented a pitch in which to bring Maarte back to life, meaning that to introduce a section for contemporary fashion. So this is where we came in with a section called PHX Maarte. So in a sense, it allowed our conference participants who took part in the mentorship program, the mentorship sessions, a chance to finally unveil their collections to the public and give the Philippine market the chance to appreciate and acquire what they had been working on. To inject new life into this bazaar, we took over 10 rooms. The bazaar is normally held at 3 floors of the Peninsula Manila Hotel. We took over 10 rooms of that hotel. That section became known as PHX Maarte, and it was a section for contemporary Philippine fashion. We worked with 3 fashion schools who selected thesis graduates to present their collections in this event. And what was fun about it was that it allowed each room's participant to go crazy, to design the room and showcase their visual vocabulary. We had 23 labels all in all participating in PHX Maarte. And because of the community building efforts we had made throughout the past 3 years, we really had no problems getting everybody to come on board and give this section really a very good run. So it was quite a success. So that's it. That's our story so far. We're open for questions right now. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, so well, Esme was just talking about, art and fashion, and that actually gives us the perfect segue into the next session, which is about artists and fashion. Lim Xiaoyun was supposed to be the chairperson for the session, but she's unable to make it, so I will take her place instead. And so if you're joining us for the first time, and if you're not, I apologize that I keep repeating the same thing, but if you are joining us for the first time, welcome to Front and Off Center Fashion in Southeast Asia at the Kotok Research Forum. My name is Nadia Wang and I'm the organizer of this conference. I'm also a lecturer at the School of Fashion at LaSalle College of the Arts in Singapore and the editor of Fashion and Market. I will be the chairperson for this 8th session, the second last one, on artists and fashion. The presenters will each give a 12 to 15-minute presentation. We will then have a joint Q&A segment. And you can type in questions for the speakers at any time. But for this particular session, the first speaker, Jakai Sirbut, he's done a pre-recorded presentation. So the questions will only have to go to Wawi Navarosa, who's our second speaker. Just give me a moment and let me pull up their bios. And I hope that all of you are enjoying the conference. So I'm going to first introduce Jakai Sirbut. He's known primarily for his textile and embroidery works, and his installations increasingly offer an element of audience participation. He is concerned with the unofficial histories that have been written out of Thai accounts, as well as intersections between personal and regional histories. He creates a delicate tension between his subject matter, ongoing conflict driven by nationalistic discrimination against minorities, and the visual sensuality of his chosen form and materials. More recently, he has begun to work with various communities through embroidery workshops, including refugees on the Thai-Myanmar border and the USA. He also worked with the Thai government on a social developmental program in remote areas of Mozambique. Studying and residing in the US for nearly 10 years, Sirbut earned his BA in Textiles and Fine Arts at Indiana University, Bloomington in 1992, and an MS in Printed Textile Design at the Philadelphia University in 1996. He was an instructor at Thammasat University's Faculty of Fine and Applied Arts from 1996 to 2003. His exhibition history includes the 9th Asia Pacific Triennial of Contemporary Art in 2018, Bangkok Art Biennale 2018, Dhaka Art Summit 2018, Patani Samasa Mayam at the Mayam Contemporary Art Museum in 2017, Displaced Bangkok Art and Culture Center in Bangkok, Thailand in 2017, First Look Collecting Contemporary at the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco, Viewpoints and Viewing Points at the 2009 Asian Art Biennial, in the National Taiwan Museum of Fine Arts in 2009, among many others. His work is included in the collections of the Singapore Art Museum, Asian Civilizations Museum, Singapore, Queensland Gallery of Art, Gallery of Modern Art, National Taiwan Museum of Fine Art, Asian Art Museum of San Francisco, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, USA, and the Very Koch Foundation in Istanbul. I am personally a big fan of his work, and just want to say that he also wrote an essay for the My Own Words series on fashion and market, and it remains one of my favorite essays to date, so you can check that out if you like. In the meantime, Acacia, could you help us to play the video of Jakai's presentation? Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Jakai Sirbut, and thank you for having me as part of this conference. Over the past 25 years, working mainly in the textile medium, I've done pretty much everything that a needle and thread would allow me to do so. But once in a while, I often find myself experimenting with garments to express my artistic ideas. Having a textile design background, it gives me an excuse to play around with clothing without having to worry about all the issues that a designer has to worry about. This presentation will give you an overview of my practice in garmenting in the past decade. Blind Faith originally conceptualized in 2011, but the works were subsequently lost. The series has been recreated and updated recently for an exhibition at the Museum of Art and Design, New York. I was inspired by multiple trips to the amulet markets in Bangkok, having seen young soldiers looking and shopping around for talismanic charms. In Thailand, military service is still compulsory, and many of the young men from low-income families and very little education are often being enlisted. These works is to address the negligence of the army, of the conscripts that are being sent to the restive deep south of Thailand, where sectarian conflicts between Thai Muslims and Thai Buddhists have been ongoing for the past 20 years. Here, Thai military uniforms are adorned with various talismanic objects, such as brass bullet shells and Buddhist amulets. The work is also a reference to the historical. The work is also a historical reference to the times when men went to war, and they often sported these talismanic tunics or were adorned with tattoos blessed by monks. It is a modern day sort of armor, because if they can't, when conscripts, they often get injured or they lose their lives. Very often their families get very little compensation. So when they cannot rely on the authority, they often resort to supernatural powers and all that for protection and well-being. Fast fashion. I created this work in response to the plight of the factory garment workers in Southeast Asia. A lot of these workers, they work a long hour and low paying jobs in undesirable conditions. And we often hear of various exploits by the factory owners. And the international brands that all the fast fashion industry that they create these garments for, they often turn a blind eye. So when these workers take to the street to demand for better wages and well-being and welfare, often they're met with resistance from governments that normally leads to a crackdown, as was the case of the Cambodian garment workers in 2014. I've selected garments from various fast fashion brands that were specifically made in this region. And I deconstructed them, each garment, and then reassembled them with materials from sarongs, all the traditional materials from sarongs or talismanic tunics, to make a new garment out of it. Then these new garments were embroidered with beads and threads of images that depict the crackdown taken from newspapers clippings, as well as the internet, along with certain phrases taken from the labor law. The intricacy of the embroidery, the beads, and the sewing made what was once a fast fashion piece of garment into a slow fashion, one-off work of art. 1820, the Singaseni tapestries. This is my most personal work to date. It was presented at the 9th Asia Pacific Triennial in Brisbane. The work consists of many components, such as large-scale quilts, garments, and audio recordings. The 5 dresses that you see here once belonged to my late mother, who suddenly died 8 years ago. So working on this project gave me an opportunity to deal with my grief by touching, by feeling, by embroidering on these garments that were once worn by my loved one. On these dresses, the colored imageries were taken from family photographs as well as her diaries, which she kept throughout her life, juxtaposed with the political events that happened during her lifetime, seen here in black and white. My mother, she was very politically engaged, and often in her diaries, there were accounts of the various marches and rallies that she went to, as well as her political views. I selected the diary entries from the year that I was born until the last entry a couple of years before her death. And each dress is actually a decade of my life with her. So the 5 dresses signify the 5 decades that I had with her before her until her last days. Changing room. Changing room is really my very first participatory artwork that requires an audience to activate it. Still on the subject of the restive Deep South, with an ongoing conflicts between Thai Muslims and Thai Buddhists. The military jacket has different connotations to different communities. To a community of Thai Buddhists, they signify security. But for Muslims, they come across as threat. Same with the kapia or the skull caps, which is also a symbol that invites suspicions and often invite harassments from the authorities. Inside the skull caps and on the jackets are embroidered with images taken from newspaper clippings and the internet of the incident in the region, drawn in the style of the children's drawing. The participatory aspects of this work was to bring attention to the general public, the ones that are, to bring attention to the self-obsessed, selfie-obsessed audience of the issues in this region by inviting them to try on the jackets and the caps, and then pose in front of a mirror, and then take a selfie and share it with the world. And hoping that from seeing these imageries, these disturbing imageries, they might start to question the context of the work, as well as to become more interested in the current affairs outside of their social media. Transient Shelter consists of 10 self-portraits. These photographs are based on the many photographs of the many portraits of my own ancestors. The poses in these portraits derive from the various memorial books traditionally produced for a high-profile funeral. So what you normally on an actual funeral book, memorial book, on the cover, you often see the deceased all decked out in their government uniforms with all the decorations, the sashes. So these decorations are usually bestowed by the king. They tell a life of a person whose achievements and social status are what left for the rest of the world to remember. What distinguishes the uniforms from the real things is the decoration. In place of the royal sashes, medals, and badges, instead they are talismanic objects such as Buddha amulets, talismanic charms, as well as these phalluses. It is a commentary on those high-powered, corrupt officials who will stop at nothing to gain as much as possible in their entire life. It is also a gentle reminder, as the Buddhist saying goes, that when you enter this earth, you come empty-handed, but when you leave, you can take possessions with you. Rape and pillage is the last work in this presentation, and it was created in 2013 in the midst of Thailand's political turmoil and polarization. These are civil servant uniforms. There are 39 civil servant uniforms representing the number of the cabinet members. Growing up a Buddhist, I had been bombarded with warnings and guidances from my parents about how to avoid creating bad karma, knowing exactly what consequences await us in afterlife. I was even taken to visit Gardens of Hell, the so-called Gardens of Hell, which is commonly found at Thai Buddhist temples. There are sculptural parks, basically, that depict scenes of purgatory to teach morals. And as a kid, I was scared enough of these statues that to this day, I still think twice before I take any actions. But contrary to the politicians and the corrupt officials, who don't seem to really care about the consequences, and they seem to get away with it at all times. And often, being above the law, they can do whatever they want to do. So I created these works, as a way to condemn these politicians, to ease out my frustrations. Each uniform is embroidered with images, faces of past and present politicians. And the politicians themselves, they're not there. Only the uniforms without the body, floating off the grounds like wandering ghosts, mingling, scheming, doing what they do best. And the audience is invited to walk through the installations, which is no different from a stroll in the Gardens of Hell.
Thank you for that, Jakai. I know he's not here, but you can feel, his energy with us, and how he's so thoughtful with all his works. It's a real privilege to have him as part of the conference. So I would now like to pass the mic over to Sharona Valeska, who is content manager at the moment at Fashion and Market, and she will tell us more about the next session. Over to you, Sharona.
Thank you, Nadia. And hello, everyone. Welcome to Front and Off Center, Fashion in Southeast Asia. Thank you all for joining us today. First of all, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Sharona Valeska. I am a fashion media practitioner based in Jakarta. And as Nadia mentioned, I am also the content manager at Fashion and Market. It is such a pleasure to be given this opportunity to chair the 9th session of the conference on fashion photography and film, which will also be the last session of day 2. We have 2 speakers for this session, Jaya Kidir and Gagandeep Singh, who are both my former classmates at LaSalle College of the Art, where we studied fashion media and industries. They will each give a 12 to 15-minute presentation. Then we will have a joint Q&A segment where you can type in the questions for the speakers. So for our first speaker, I would like to introduce Jaya Kidir. Jaya Kidir is a multidisciplinary image maker who works fluidly across the mediums of photography and filmmaking. His practice often explores the convergence between fashion, identity, and socio-political circumstance, and documents how unintended slippages could arise out of these phenomena. All right, Jaya, over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jaya. Thank you for having me at this conference. So today I will be speaking about my journey and creative processes as an image maker in the context of the Singaporean fashion creative industry in 2 overlapping realms, the personal and the commercial. So in this presentation, I will be speaking about 3 personal works that authentically reflects my views on society together with like-minded individuals during my time in school at LaSalle College of the Arts when I was an undergraduate, and various commercial and editorial works in the publishing house that I currently work at as a full-timer, in which it is a compromise between my personal views and how the fashion image should be presented in consultation with the views of fashion businesses and editors who I work with. I'll try my best in 15 minutes to give you an overview of my journey as a fashion creative so far. So who am I? I'm currently working full-time as a digital creative editor who mainly is making photographic and videographic works for a media publishing house that produces fashion and lifestyle magazines such as Grazia Singapore, Men's Folio, and Luxo. As you can see on this Venn diagram, the distinction between the personal and commercial is sometimes quite blurred. There are commercial works that I've made that has been personal for me, and there's personal works that in hindsight, I felt I could have made it better through more precise application of techniques that I've learned in my professional career. I'll expound on the left side of the Venn diagram through 3 projects that I've made that is personal for me. So before I do that, the definition of personal according to Cambridge Dictionary is as follows. And I would like to say that the works that I will briefly talk about is related to all 3 definitions of the word personal. So the first personal work I will talk about from my university days is called Sopan, of which is a 1-minute fashion film that reimagines an egalitarian, post-colonial.
I think there's something going on with your mic. Do you think you will be able to fix that? So hi, so sorry. I think
Sorry.
so sorry, yeah, I think something's going on with your mic.
Is it better now?
Yes, I think it is. All right, we can continue. So sorry for the inconvenience.
So this fashion film is an egalitarian, post-colonial, post-gender society in the Nusantara region, and it aims to reimagine that through fashion accessories, mainly hats that we conceptually made and brought it into reality. Is it sharing? Sorry. Sorry. So this film was a combination of a collaborative effort made by 4 persons, my classmates and I. And in a way, it is a visual amalgamation of 4 persons' backgrounds and beliefs, and our collective interpretation of dressing modestly in a Southeast Asian context. As the person responsible for the film and image making aspect, I researched on the historical precedent of societies in the Nusantara, such as the Bugis, who were open to a non-heteronormative gender identity and how they dressed in a modest yet gender-affirming way that aligned to their cultural traditions. Also, I referenced how scarves were worn in the Nusantara during the 60s and 70s, which were more relaxed and up to the wearer's interpretation prior to the Islamic revivalist movement happening in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore in the 80s and 90s, up till today. These visual tensions are translated in the film in a sense where the setting is a traditional house called a kampong, which anchors the whole film in the context of the Nusantara, which is perceived to be conservative and backward to urban progress. And this is seemingly juxtaposed by queer yet modest persons that we casted in this film. We also reference Southeast Asian films made in the 2000s, which had this warm, soft filter glow and saturated look to it. And also, since the song I had used was a reinterpretation of a song that featured prominently in the opening of the film Sepet, made by the late Malaysian filmmaker Yasmin Ahmad. So that's the brief overview of this work. So secondly, this work is titled Samsara, a fashion film that contemplates an entanglement between past, present, and future through juxtaposing fabrics that has been produced for centuries in traditional Javanese and Tamil attires, set in a current day setting to show how the human condition still remains despite vast stretches of time and leaps in technological progress. So in terms of the research underpinning this project, the main starting point for me was looking into the origins of computing and how they are actually intertwined with fabrics such as brocade and jacquard are made with like jacquard looms. And little do we know that jacquard looms are actually now everywhere in our midst, a bit in the form of computer and mobile screens, where they form weaves and pixels, inputs by ones and zeros via binary code, very much like the punch holes programmed to make these brocade fabrics. From there, we made a connection from intricate patterns formed in fabrics to digital images, both significant mediums which might take for granted. So you can see the research process for this work. On top of this, we made connections of historical migrations and cultural commonalities between Javanese and Tamil societies right before Arab, Dutch, and British settlers came in. The corsets that featured heavily in this film is representative of European culture during the colonial era that defined how a desirable woman should posture themselves. And it is the woman in this film that is caught enmeshed in between these two polarizing worlds of supposed past, progress, tradition, and future. All these historical details that I've gathered are then visually translated into a semi-fictional fashion image of sorts that acknowledges real-world occurrences. So the next work I will be talking about is called Yalam, spelled backwards. It's called Malay. It's a mirror image of the word Malay. This would be my most personal work, as the methodology and approach is the inverse and opposite from the previous works. There is no art direction, styling, or conceptual overtones to shape the fashion image. Rather, it is about addressing lived realities of 30 Malay Singaporean cisgender men through a 452-page book and documenting what is already existing rather than translating and synthesizing research into a visual language. This project addresses how they negotiate their identity in the context of today's Singapore through dressing and in different ways according to the social situation and how they present themselves at work, with friends or family. As much as this project was a study about the ways in which Malay Singaporean cisgender men express themselves through fashion, it is also a study on the material culture, oral, as well as written history that makes up each individual's homes, through the intertwining threads from multiple sources that make up this lived experience, modern day objects found across the world that hint at the fashioning of self-identity that is almost universal at a global level, even in this Singaporean Southeast Asian context. Shoe boxes, as you can see, fragrances, shavers, combs, hangers, books, magazines that hint at this identity. So now I'll be talking about the commercial aspect of my work. So these three definitions is as follows and defines the work that I do in my full-time job. So this was my first fashion spread for Men's Folio, a Singaporean fashion magazine that I interned at 2 years ago and still work at now. I'm very grateful to have met the people who I work under that gave me an opportunity to showcase my talent. As you can see, in terms of the photography, there are some overlaps in my personal practice, as the fashion story is also a partial commentary on political elections and at the same time showcasing various looks from Fendi to Louis Vuitton. This was during a time where public conversations in the media landscape regarding race relations and privilege in Singapore was at an all-time high. It was also a surprise for me in hindsight for the editor-in-chief back then to approve this story. I think today it would have been vetoed. However, as time went by and I joined the company as a full-timer at the same publishing house that I interned at, and in the years that followed, the media fashion landscape as a whole became averse to such risk-taking in terms of bringing up social issues in their spreads, as some magazines in other publication houses got warning letters and penalties for featuring certain topics and themes. Most things you see today in a Singaporean fashion magazine are an abstraction of social situations in the context of fashion and product spreads, which is kind of the default mode for global fashion magazines for decades, because that way it is easier not to offend a fashion brand or potentially tarnish a brand image. And that bringing up social issues through like fashion spreads is sort of an anomaly in Singapore. So these are some of the fashion images I've made over the years, according to the mood board, as well as the art direction submitted by my colleagues, who are either a fashion editor or creative director, to be approved by the headquarters of various fashion brands. So you can tell the logos and brandings in the fashion object gives it away to the reader. And it is obviously an advert for these objects, and to evoke a certain desire through aesthetics or an imagined fantasy conveyed by these images. Today, I would say that commercial fashion image making is very much geared towards appealing the reader's personal sensibilities through world building and gestures that hint at certain occasion, environment, or social situation. So lastly, why I picked this image is because it encapsulates the many challenges we have to contend in terms of consumerism, that is perpetuated by the global market. And it's sad to say that I'm also contributing to that problem as an image maker in my commercial practice, as most fashion publication editors and creatives and how they produce their work is in many ways dictated by the fashion house conglomerates directly or indirectly. In conclusion, there are various overlaps between the personal and the commercial aspect of my work in fashion image making. In my commercial practice, I would have to constantly respond to photographic trends globally, ranging from China, South Korea, to Europe and the US. And with most recently, the introduction of AI in image making, which I believe is also a tool that could subjectively improve the quality of someone's work, but it is also a challenging prospect to mull over in terms of ethics. The main difference that in terms of personal work that I've presented, I do not have to follow brand guidelines or art director's vision and instead rely on my own research and come up with the visual translations that I've intended to without any pressure whatsoever to do the things that I'm actually interested in investigating, such as fashion history and identity. However, reality is much more complicated, as most of you are aware that I'm not someone who is born of privilege or wealth, and thus I'm reliant on my full-time wage as of now to fund the things that I actually would like to produce and research maybe next time. And the projects that I made in my personal practice as an undergraduate was instrumental in developing my visual language and putting them into practice in both the realms of the commercial and the personal. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaya, for that wonderful presentation. If you have any questions for Jaya, you can type it in the chat box and we'll go through them at the end of the session. And up next, I would like to introduce our second speaker, Gagandeep Singh. Okay, hi Gandeep. So Gagandeep Singh is a Singapore-based image maker whose talents stretch far and wide across various professions, including creative direction, set design, fashion styling, and production. Considering himself a visual storyteller, Singh's work often stems from text, be that from poetry, audio, or script, to derive a visual counterpart that allows him to tell stories in a unique way. Singh has worked on advertising projects for Singapore Tourism Board, Adidas Singapore, and G-Shock Singapore, while contributing editorial work to local titles such as Harper's Bazaar and Female Magazine. So without any further ado, I will pass the mic over to Gandeep.
Hello, good evening or afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for the lovely introduction. Sharona, sorry, just let me share screen real quick. Okay. I would like to thank the Research Forum and Fashion and Market for inviting me to join Jaya and Sharona for the fashion photography and film session today. My name is Gandeep and I am an art director and fashion stylist based in Singapore. I'd like to begin with a quick introduction to who I am and what it is that I do within my role as an art director. Throughout the years, this has extended to that of a set designer, of a fashion stylist. During my time in these roles, I have completed advertising projects for Singapore Tourism Board, Adidas, and Lenskart Singapore. And I've also contributed editorial work to Harper's Bazaar and Female Singapore. Additionally, I've also led creative projects for National University of Singapore and LaSalle College. Extending outside the scope of fashion, I have worked on music videos as the lead set designer for local artists such as Young Raja and Haven. And I've also gone on to direct campaigns for local brands. What I would like to focus on today is a singular piece of work that is near and dear to my heart. Titled In Pursuit of Temples in the Sky, this project was completed in my final year as a fashion media and industry student in LaSalle in 2021. To date, this project stands as the only piece of work I've created that has allowed me to explore all aspects of my own identity across culture, religion, and sexuality. It's an exploration of uniting the worlds of religion and sexuality, in this instance, Sikhism and homosexuality, and makes an attempt to reintroduce the accurate teachings of Sikhism that have been diluted by societal beliefs and practices. I began the project by asking myself this question. If what I was taught when I was growing up was true, and that being Sikh and gay was entirely impossible, then how was it that I existed? When you delve into Sikhism as a religion, one of its key teachings focuses on how each individual is to be treated with respect, regardless of their race, personal beliefs, gender, or sexuality. And that is why In Pursuit of Temples in the Sky was created. Present a world in which these two themes collide. When viewed in completion, the project presents itself as a one-off volume of visual work spanning across a 392-page publication and a short film which runs for 2 minutes and 21 seconds, which I will screen at the end of this presentation. In order to construct visual narratives, the project is developed using 3 tracks. The body of work of poet Avtar Singh Pash, excerpts from the poetry of Richard Sicken, and an essay written by Daniel L. Schechter of Harvard University titled The 7 Sins of Memory. So how I worked on this was, the writings of the poets are examined and dismantled, and then assembled through overlapping themes that are identified. In response to imagining a reality in which these concepts coexist, the study of the 7 Sins of Memory is applied, which aids in informing the techniques in which the writings of Pash and Sicken are interpreted into imagery. You see cultural Sikh references littered throughout the project. For instance, in chapter 1 of the book on the left, stacked metal tin lunchboxes are seen when the set is meant to replicate a home setting. In chapter 2, manjis, which are bamboo woven beds we see in every household in Punjab, are utilized within the set as well. I'm happy to share that I did not have to leave the house to source these items. The obvious Sikh cultural references take a step back in chapters 3 and 4, titled The Wound of the Valentine and The Most Dangerous for the Small Weird Loves. These chapters are designed to reflect inner turmoil. Within these pages, we see a lot of struggle of self. Models are represented in a singular light, exploring their surroundings in an attempt to find their individual voice. Immediately following the topic of inner turmoil, chapter 5, titled Dirty Rain and Flying Eagles on the left, is set against the backdrop of a glass house in a sugarcane field and presents the union of 2 beings. On the right-hand side, chapter 7, Face to Face with Scheherazade, the closing chapter of the book is meant to portray a welcoming to Sikhism, and thus is the chapter that displays the most visually significant Sikh symbols. Within this chapter, we see the 5 Ks, which are the 5 outward visual signifiers that each Sikh is supposed to adorn on a daily basis. These include the kanga, a small wooden comb that is supposed to be kept within the hair at all times, a kirpan, which is a dagger that symbolizes a Sikh's duty to come to the defense of those in peril, a kachera, a cotton pair of shorts to be worn as a symbol of chastity, a kara, a steel bracelet to be worn on the right wrist as a symbol of unbreakable attachment and commitment to God, and the cage, which is the practice of allowing one's hair to grow naturally. These objects also extend to key film scenes. While much of the film is cut rapidly, the slow scenes within the film help ground the image through its portrayal of these key Sikh visual signifiers. A second key visual signifier is injected into the film and image-making process via the aspect of styling. Intricate fabrics are draped over what is generally classified as Western clothing. Typically, when in Sikhism, fabric is seen as being quite an important visual cue, whether it is depicted as a Sikh man or woman wearing the turban, or when it is used on the body for modesty. Perhaps in a much less obvious way, the teachings of Sikhism were also interpreted through human interaction. Acts of care and kindness signify the importance of protecting all that surround you. The exchanges between characters are interpreted from the writings of Pash and Sicken. For instance, in the poem, Sicken states, "Leave me blurry and fall towards me with your entire body," or "I take my hands off and I give them to you." Or when Pash mentions in his poem, "Imagine Surrender." These excerpts are used as reference points for the models and their interactions with their surroundings and amongst themselves. The project also places the idea of contradiction at the forefront. This was achieved by pitting themes of chaos and calmness, sensuality and eroticism, strength and vulnerability against one another. Film scenes are placed back to back depicting the 2 individual themes, or by slicing a longer scene with fast cuts of a secondary scene. Similarly, in the book, the layout is interpreted in the same way as the film. Pages that sit side by side depict 2 different moods, one of calmness, one of chaos, one of dependency, one of strength. Because this is a project that was highly reflective of who I am as an individual, the use of mirrors and reflective surfaces were used as a tool to depict inner turmoil. Images were also layered one over the other to showcase the multiplication of selves, the different versions that we have amongst ourselves. Before I end off my presentation, I would like to take some time to play the film for you. So yeah, that's it from me. Thank you.
So we have come to the end of Front and Off Center, Fashion in Southeast Asia. Thank you to Dr. Acacia Finbo at the Cohort Research Forum for making this online conference such a seamless experience. I could not have done this without you. And thank you to all the presenters and chairpersons for your time and enriching the event with all the amazing work that you do. I look forward to seeing all that you continue to do. And I would again like to acknowledge, of course, the limitations of the conference. This is by no means exhaustive, and there is so much more to uncover. I've enjoyed hearing all the stories that have been shared, especially processes and motivations behind creative and practical decisions that have been made. I look forward to seeking, listening to, and highlighting more stories of more practitioners in the years to come. If you are similarly interested in stories on fashion in Southeast Asia, come join us over at Fashion and Market on Instagram and visit us on fashionandmarket.net. There's already a trove of stories published, and we will only add more. I look forward to the next time we gather to talk about fashion in Southeast Asia, online or in person. Till then, goodbye.